The afternoon sun was soft, casting a warm golden light over the parking lot of the town's only public firing range. Cars were neatly lined up, and the muffled sounds of gunfire could be heard from inside, each sharp crack echoing in the distance. The place was busy, groups of friends laughing between rounds, serious-looking shooters adjusting their gear, and a few newcomers nervously checking in at the front counter. Into this lively scene walked Marcia Thompson. She didn't look like the kind of person anyone would expect to see at a firing range. She was dressed simply, plain jeans, a faded sweatshirt, and worn sneakers. Her hair was neatly tied back in a low bun, and in her right hand she carried an old, weathered rifle case. It wasn't one of those shiny, high-tech cases like other shooters had. This one looked like it had been around for decades. The moment she stepped inside, a few heads turned. Not out of malice at first, just curiosity. She moved slowly, her steps calm and measured, as if she had all the time in the world. She didn't rush to find a lane or talk to anyone. She just walked to the front desk, signed in, and quietly handed over her range fee. But as she made her way to the shooting area, the whispers began. A couple of younger men standing near the vending machine exchanged smirks. One of them nudged the other with his elbow and nodded toward her. "Looks like somebody's grandma is here to try shooting for the first time," he said with a laugh. The other chuckled, glancing at her case. "That thing's probably older than she is." Marcia didn't seem to hear them. Or maybe she did, but chose not to respond. Her face was unreadable, her eyes focused on her lane assignment. She passed several shooters already in action. Men and women with sleek, modern rifles, wearing ear protection that costs more than more than most people's monthly rent. Compared to them, she looked almost out of place. At the far end of the range, she reached her assigned lane. She placed her rifle case on the bench, setting it down gently, as if it was holding something precious. Then she began to unpack her things. First, she set out a small pouch with a few simple tools. Next came a folded cloth, which she spread neatly over the bench. And finally, she unzipped the case and slowly revealed the rifle inside. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't new. But anyone with a trained eye would notice something important. This rifle had been maintained with obsessive care. Every part gleamed under the overhead lights. The metal was spotless, the stock polished. It was the kind of weapon that told a story without a single word being spoken. The young men from earlier had drifted closer, pretending to check their own gear while keeping an eye on her. One of them grinned and called out, "Hey ma'am, you want some tips before you get started? We could give you a quick lesson so you don't embarrass yourself." His friends laughed quietly. Marcia didn't look up. She calmly placed the rifle on the bench, adjusted the stand, and began checking her scope. Her movements were slow, precise, and deliberate. Not the fumbling hands of a beginner, but the steady control of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. Still, to the men watching, her silence seemed like shyness. One of them whispered, "She's probably never even fired that thing. Bet she won't hit the paper." Another voice, older and rougher, spoke from behind them. "Careful, boys. Might want to watch before you talk." They turned and saw an older man leaning against the wall, arms crossed, a faint smile on his lips. He didn't explain further, just kept watching Marcia. She placed her ear protection on, adjusted it snugly, then slid a single round into the rifle with the ease of someone who didn't need to think about the motion. She leaned forward, settling into her stance. Her breathing slowed. The noise of the range seemed to fade for her, everything narrowing down to the target in front of her. The men smirked again, waiting for the inevitable miss they were so sure was coming. But Marcia didn't notice them. She was somewhere else entirely, in a place where only the rifle, the target, and her steady hands existed. Her finger rested lightly on the trigger, And in that moment, though no one knew it yet, the atmosphere of the firing range was about to change completely. Asterisk. The lane was quiet, except for the faint hum of the overhead lights and the muffled gunfire from the other shooters nearby. Marcia leaned forward slightly, her cheek resting gently against the rifle stock. Her breathing was steady. Her eyes locked on the distant paper target. The young men who had mocked her earlier lingered a few feet away, pretending to adjust their magazines, but clearly watching her every move. One of them chuckled under his breath, "All right, let's see Grandma try not to drop the gun." His friend smirked, shaking his head as if the outcome was already certain. But Marcia didn't flinch. She didn't even glance in their direction. Her focus was absolute. She took a slow inhale, then let it out halfway, a practiced breathing technique, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle cracked with a sharp, clean sound that cut through the range noise. The recoil was light in her hands, her grip firm and controlled. A small hole appeared dead center in the bullseye. For a moment, nobody spoke. Even the mocking young men froze, their smirks fading slightly. "That's just luck," one of them muttered quickly, as if trying to convince himself. Marcia didn't respond. She calmly loaded another round, adjusted the scope ever so slightly, and fired again. The shot landed directly through the same hole as before, making it almost impossible to see two separate impacts. The man nearest to her actually stepped forward to check the target through the range binoculars. His jaw tightened. "No way," he mumbled. A couple of other shooters further down the range had started to notice. One man wearing tactical ear protection stopped mid-reload and leaned over to see what was going on. A woman at the far end, who had been practicing rapid fire, paused and looked down toward Marcia's lane. Marcia didn't acknowledge any of them. Her motions were calm and deliberate. Eject the casing, load the next round, check the wind. Flag, align the scope, fire. Every single shot was precise, each one hitting the exact center with surgical accuracy. After the fifth round, one of the young men laughed nervously. "Kay, maybe she's been here before," he said, though his voice had lost its earlier arrogance. "Been here before," the older man from earlier said with a chuckle. "Son, you have no idea." Marcia began switching to more challenging targets, smaller, farther, and some even moving slightly on the motorized rig. Without breaking rhythm, she landed every shot. The metal clink of each hit echoed in the air, sharp and undeniable. By now, more than half the range had gone silent, shooters setting their rifles down just to watch. The quiet hum of conversation shifted from mocking to whispered awe. People were pulling out their phones, recording the display unfolding in front of them. The young men who had mocked her earlier were no longer laughing. They exchanged uneasy glances, clearly realizing they had misjudged her completely. One of them finally spoke up, trying to regain a little pride. "Hey, nice shooting. Where'd you learn to do that?" Marcia glanced at him briefly, the faintest hint of a smile touching her lips. "Practice," she said simply, then loaded another round. Her next few shots weren't just good, they were flawless. The grouping was so tight that even experienced marksmen in the room were shaking their heads in disbelief. Someone muttered, "That's not just skill, that's training." The young men stood quietly now, their earlier arrogance replaced with something else entirely, respect mixed with embarrassment. They didn't know who she was yet, but they could feel it. She was someone, and in the next part of the day, they would find out exactly who they had been mocking, and it would change the way they looked at her forever. The firing range had transformed from a place of scattered noise into a room holding its breath. Every few seconds, the sharp crack of Marcia's rifle broke the silence, followed by the metallic ping of her bullet hitting steel or the neat tear through paper. People who had been there for hours were now leaning on the dividers, their own firearms forgotten, just to watch her work. The young men who had mocked her earlier had stopped pretending they weren't impressed. They stood a few feet behind her, quiet and stiff, watching as each bullet landed exactly where she wanted it to. It was no longer luck. To them, it was something they couldn't quite understand. Marcia adjusted the rifle once more. This time switching the target to the farthest lane possible. A range attendant, curious, stepped closer and asked if she wanted the target motorized for movement. Yes, she said softly, her voice calm but steady. The target began sliding side to side, unpredictable in its pace. Several shooters muttered among themselves. Hitting a moving target at this distance was difficult for even the most experienced. Marcia took a single, slow breath, exhaled halfway, and fired. The bullet struck dead center, the target swinging slightly from the impact. Without a pause, she fired again. Another perfect hit, almost identical to the first. A low whistle came from somewhere in the crowd. One of the older men at the range stepped closer, studying her rifle. He tilted his head, recognition flickering across his face. "That's not just any rifle," he said quietly to the man beside him. "That's an M40A5. Military issue? And that kind of grouping. I've seen it before." The younger man frowned. "Where?" "In the service," the older man replied. "In Afghanistan. There was a sniper who could shoot like that. Could hit a moving target at 900 yards without breaking a sweat. They called her Deadeye." The younger man's eyes widened as the pieces began to connect. The rumor spread quickly. A few whispered, "She's military." Others said, "No, she's retired special forces." Some just shook their heads, too stunned to guess. Finally, the range attendant, curious and unable to contain himself, approached between shots. "Ma'am," he said respectfully, "if you don't mind me asking, where did you learn to shoot like that?" Marcia glanced at him, her expression unreadable. "Work," she replied simply, then went back to her stance. It wasn't an answer. Not really, but it wasn't a lie either. Behind her, one of the young men who had mocked her earlier was beginning to squirm. It's a realization that they might have made a fool of themselves in front of someone with a serious military background was sinking in. "Man, we didn't know," he muttered to his friend. "No," his friend whispered back, "and I think it's better if we don't say anything else," but it was too late for their shame to disappear. Too many people had noticed. The crowd around them was watching the display with quiet respect, and the story was already starting to form. By the time Marcia lowered her rifle and removed her ear protection, the range felt different. It wasn't the place she had walked into earlier, filled with quiet judgment and laughter behind her back. Now it was a room full of people who couldn't stop wondering, who exactly was this quiet, simple-looking woman? And in the next moments, someone would answer that question, and once they did, her presence at the range would never be forgotten. The air inside the firing range carried a quiet tension, the kind that comes right before a big truth is about to drop. Marcia placed her rifle on the bench, her hands moving with the same calm precision she'd shown since she arrived. She began cleaning the barrel, wiping it down with care. The crowd that had gathered behind her was larger now, a mix of curious shooters, range staff, and even a few people who had stopped by just to see what all the whispers were about. The older man who had been watching from the start stepped forward. His voice was steady, but carried a weight that demanded attention. "I know who you are," he said, his eyes fixed on her. Marcia didn't look up. "Do you?" He nodded slowly. "You were in Kandahar. 3rd Battalion. You took the shot that saved an entire convoy from an ambush. At 1,200 yards, that was you." A ripple of surprise went through the crowd. A few people exchanged stunned glances. Someone whispered, "No way. That's her." The young men who had mocked her earlier suddenly felt the heat of every pair of eyes in the room. They shifted awkwardly, wishing they could vanish. The older man continued. They called you Shadow Widow, didn't they? Because the moment you lined up a shot, the target never knew they were already gone. Finally, Marcia looked up. Her gaze was calm but piercing, the kind of look that seemed to see right through a person. She didn't confirm the name, but she didn't deny it either. The range attendant, trying to process what he was hearing, asked softly, "Ma'am, you're a Marine sniper." Marcia gave a faint smile. Was a long time ago. Room was silent, except for the distant thuds of other shooters far down the building. Even those sounds seemed smaller now, overshadowed by the weight of the moment. One of the younger shooters, who had been recording on his phone, whispered, "I'm not deleting this. No one's gonna believe I saw this in person." Another muttered, "She's probably got more confirmed kills than anyone in this room has fired bullets." The young man who had first made fun of her finally stepped forward, his voice low and awkward. I'm sorry. We didn't know." Marcia's eyes met his for a brief moment. "Then maybe next time," she said evenly. "You'll think before you speak." No one laughed this time. The respect in the room was tangible now, replacing the earlier arrogance. The people watching weren't just looking at a skilled shooter anymore. They were looking at a living legend. Someone whose abilities had been honed in life-or-death situations. Most of them couldn't imagine. She reassembled her rifle with practiced efficiency. Every click of metal on metal sounding sharper in the quiet room. With her gear packed, she stood, slinging the rifle case over her shoulder. The older man gave a small nod of respect. "It's an honor," he said simply. Marcia returned the nod. "Take care of your aim," she replied, then began walking toward the exit as she passed. People stepped aside, giving her space, not out of fear, but out of recognition. For the young men who had mocked her at the start, the day had turned into something they'd never forget. They had walked in thinking they were the best shots in the room, and they were leaving knowing they had been in the presence of someone on a completely different level. And for everyone else in the range, her visit had become more than just an afternoon of shooting. It had become a story they would tell for years. Marcia was halfway to the door when she stopped. The weight of the stairs behind her was unmistakable, not the mocking, judgmental eyes she'd walked past earlier, but eyes now filled with curiosity, respect, and a touch of disbelief. She turned slightly, scanning the room. The older man still stood by her lane, arms crossed, a faint smile of recognition on his face. The range attendant was frozen mid-step, as if afraid to interrupt the moment. Even the young men who had laughed at her earlier were watching her like they were afraid to blink. "Set up a target," she said suddenly, her voice steady. The attendant blinked. How far?" She tilted her head slightly. "Farthest. You've got." The crowd stirred with excitement. People began murmuring. Phones came out. And a few shooters hurried to stop what they were doing so they could watch. The attendant nodded and quickly sent the motorized target rolling all the way to the end, a distance so far that the bullseye was barely a speck to the naked eye. The paper target swayed slightly as it settled. Marcia walked back to her lane, unzipped her case again, and pulled out the rifle with the same care she'd shown earlier. She set it up, checked the scope, and adjusted the bipod dot without rushing. She took a small piece of tape from her bag and covered her right eye's lens on the scope. The crowd exchanged confused glances. Why would she block her own view? She lay down prone, resting the rifle perfectly on the bench. With her right eye closed, she lined up the shot entirely with her left. A murmur rippled through the crowd. This was not something they saw every day. "Is she?" someone whispered. "Left high shooting at that distance." Another replied, incredulous. Marcia inhaled slowly, then exhaled halfway. Her finger rested on the trigger. Time seemed to slow. Crack. The sound cut through the range like lightning. Everyone leaned forward instinctively, their eyes locked on the distant target. Through the binoculars, the attendant's mouth dropped open. "Dead center," he said quietly. "Left eye, dead center." But she wasn't done. Without moving her body from position, she loaded another round and fired again. The second bullet split through the first, creating a single, jagged hole that was nearly impossible to see. Without magnification, the older man let out a low whistle. "She's showing off now," he said with a grin. The crowd erupted in quiet awe. No loud cheers, no wild applause, just a deep, respectful silence filled with the weight of what they had just witnessed. Marcia stood slowly, her movements deliberate. She placed the rifle back in its case, zipped it up, and slung it over her shoulder. "Practice," she said simply. As if that explained everything. The range attendant shook his head with a smile. "That's not just practice, ma'am. Mastery?" She gave him a small nod and started toward the door again. This time, no one blocked her way. The crowd parted without a word, each person stepping back to give her a clear path. As she passed the young men who had mocked her earlier, she stopped briefly. "One day," she said softly, "you might meet someone who's better than you. Don't make the mistake of underestimating them." Then she left, the door swinging closed behind her. For several moments after she was gone, no one spoke. The only sound was the distant hum of the target motors and the faint smell of gunpowder, lingering in the air. Then, slowly, the conversations began again. Not about themselves, not about their own shots, but about her. And every single person there knew they had just seen something they might never see again. Asterisk by the next morning. The story was already moving. It started with a few grainy phone videos, shaky clips taken from the back of the range, showing Marcia's flawless bullseyes and the impossible left-eye shot that split her first bullet in half. The footage didn't have perfect sound, but it didn't need it. You could still hear the gasp from the crowd, the quiet murmurs, and the disbelief in their voices. On social media, the videos were labeled with captions like "Grandma humiliates," "Everyone at the range," and "Don't judge a book by its cover." By noon, they had been shared hundreds of times. By evening, thousands. The young men who had mocked her the day before kept a low profile online. But in the videos, their laughter could be heard at the start, and their silence after the first. Few shots was obvious. People began commenting. You can feel the regret in their faces. "This woman is the real deal. She's not just good, she's elite. Who is she? Someone needs to find out." It didn't take long before someone did. The older man from the range, the one who had recognized her, posted in a veterans group. "That's Marcia Thompson. Former Marine Scout sniper, served 2 tours in Afghanistan. If you know, you know." The post exploded. Veterans from across the country began chiming in with stories. Some had served with her, others had only heard the tales. The 1,200-yard convoy shot, the impossible mountain ridge target. The night mission where she saved her entire unit. By the end of the week, Marcia's name was trending in small circles online. Local news picked it up next, running a short piece titled "Former Marine Sniper Stuns Crowd at Local Firing Range." The segment showed clips from the viral videos, though Marcia herself hadn't spoken publicly. When a reporter called the range for a comment, the owner just laughed. "All I'll say is, she's welcome here anytime. And I wouldn't bet against her." Meanwhile, Marcia carried on with her life as if nothing unusual had happened. She went to work, ran her errands, and only visited the range again for her own practice, choosing quiet times when she knew fewer people would be around. But even in her everyday routine, she could feel the shift. A few strangers recognized her at the grocery store. A young man at the gas station asked if she was the sniper lady from the video. Even the mailman, usually quiet, gave her a small nod and said, "Saw you online. Impressive work. Back at the range, the story had already turned into something of a legend. New members would come in and ask, "Is this where that sniper woman shot the moving target with her left eye?" The regulars would grin and tell the story, each version. Growing a little bigger with each retelling, she hit a dime at 800 yards, someone would say. No, it was a bottle cap at 1,000. Another would argue the truth didn't even matter anymore. What mattered was the lesson everyone had taken away. The young men from that day had returned to the range several times since. They didn't speak much about what happened, but they carried themselves differently now. The arrogance was gone, replaced with a quiet caution. They shot more carefully, listened more, and never mocked anyone who walked through the door again. And somewhere, deep down, they knew they had been lucky. Lucky that the day they crossed paths with Marcia Thompson, she had chosen to teach them with skill instead of words. It had been nearly 2 months since that afternoon at the firing range, and Marcia thought the attention was finally fading. The initial viral wave had slowed, the local news had moved on to fresher stories, and the videos were now buried under newer trends online. She could go about her errands without being stopped, and even her visits to the range were met with polite nods instead of curious stares. She liked it that way, quiet, normal. But the peace didn't last. One cold morning, as Marcia sat on her porch sipping coffee, she noticed a car idling at the end of her driveway. It wasn't unusual for people to slow down when passing her. Small countryside home, the old oak trees and white fence had a certain postcard charm, but this car didn't move on. After a minute, the driver's door opened and a man stepped out. He was in his mid-40s, wearing a dark jacket and carrying a leather satchel. His walk was calm, deliberate, but it wasn't the walk of someone dropping by for casual conversation. When he reached her gate, he paused. "Ma'am, are you Marcia Thompson?" Marcia's grip on her coffee mug tightened slightly. "Depends on who's asking." He introduced himself as Daniel Cross, an investigative military journalist. He'd worked on profiles of decorated veterans, often telling the stories the public never got to hear. "I'm here about that day at the firing range," he said. "And more importantly, about the things you did long before that day." Marcia raised an eyebrow. "And what makes you think I'll talk to you about any of it?" Cross smiled faintly. "'Cause the people who served with you still talk about you. And they think your story matters. Not the viral video, the real story." Her instinct was to shut him down immediately. She didn't like talking about her military past unless it was to fellow veterans who understood the weight of it. The public, in her mind, didn't need to know the details. They weren't there. They couldn't understand. But there was something in his tone, a careful mix of respect and curiosity, that kept her from walking away. "Talk," she said finally. "But I'm not promising you'll get anything worth printing." They sat on her porch for hours. Cross asked about her early days in the Marines, how she'd been one of the few women to pass sniper school, the missions that had earned her a reputation among both allies and enemies. She gave short, careful answers at first, avoiding certain details. But as the morning went on, she found herself telling more about the freezing nights on the mountainside, the hours lying perfectly still in desert heat, the moments where one breath too loud could mean the end. Cross didn't take notes. He just listened, occasionally asking quiet questions that kept her talking. By the time the sun was overhead, he closed his satchel and stood. "You might not think your story matters," he said, "but it does. Not just to the people who served with you, but to every young woman who thinks she can't make it in a field where people expect her to fail. You're living proof they can." Marcia didn't respond right away. She wasn't used to thinking of her career as inspiration to her. It had simply been her job. But she couldn't deny there was truth in what he said. "Print whatever you want," she said finally, "but don't make it a fairy tale. Tell it the way it was." As Cross walked back to his car, she realized something. That day at the firing range, as much as she'd wanted to forget it, had opened a door she hadn't expected, a door that might make her past impossible to keep to herself. And somewhere deep inside, she wasn't sure if that was a bad thing anymore. 3 weeks later. Marcia's quiet life was interrupted again, but this time, it wasn't by a stranger's car at the end of her driveway. It was by the sound of her old landline ringing, a phone she barely used except for the occasional call from a fellow veteran or a utility company. She picked it up. "Marcia, it's Daniel Cross." She could hear the excitement in his voice before he even said the words. "The articles live, and it's blowing up." Cross had done exactly what he promised. The piece wasn't dressed up with unnecessary drama or exaggerated heroics. It was honest. He wrote about her early struggles in a male-dominated unit, the years of training in grueling conditions, and the life-and-death missions that demanded absolute precision. He also included the story of the firing range, not as a viral stunt, but as a reminder of the skill and discipline she still carried quietly into civilian life. But what Marcia didn't expect was how people reacted. Veteran groups began sharing it, calling her an example of professionalism and humility. Young women in ROTC programs wrote comments like, "She's the reason I'm not quitting." Even strangers who knew nothing about military life were moved, sharing it with messages like, "This is why you never underestimate someone." Then came the surprise she never saw coming. One Saturday afternoon, Marcia walked into the same firing range where everything had started. The moment she stepped inside, heads turned, but this time there was no smirking, no whispers. People straightened up, nodding respectfully. At the far end, the 3 young men who had mocked her that first day were standing together, their rifles slung over their shoulders. They froze when they saw her. For a moment, no one moved. Then the oldest of the 3 stepped forward. "We read the article," he said quietly. We didn't realize who you were, or what you've done, and we're sorry." For real this time? Marcia studied him for a long moment, then gave a single nod. "Apology accepted," she said simply. But instead of walking away, she glanced at their rifles and asked, "You 3 still want those shooting tips you offered me that day?" They looked confused, almost embarrassed. We're sure we could learn more from you." Marcia's faint smile returned. "Good. Grab a lane." For the next hour, she worked with them, correcting their stances, showing them breathing techniques, teaching them how to read wind flags. She didn't talk about her past, not a single war story, but they listened to every word like it was gospel. When they were done, one of them asked, "Why help us after the way we treated you?" Marcia locked her rifle case and met his eyes. "Because one day, you might be better than you are now. And when that happens, I hope you remember to help the next person instead of laugh at them." As she left the range that day, the same older man who'd recognized her months ago gave her a knowing nod. She returned it. No more explanation was needed. Marcia walked out into the fading light, the sound of distant gunfire behind her. Knowing her name might be known now, but her purpose had never changed. She didn't shoot to prove a point or to chase glory. She shot because it was who she was, and somewhere in the crowd of shooters that day, maybe there was another person who would remember her, not just for her skill, but for the lesson she left behind. It had been a month since Marcia's quiet training session with the young men who once mocked her, and she assumed the moment would fade like so many others in life, an afternoon remembered only by those present. But word travels fast, and respect once earned the hard way has a way of multiplying. The 3 men she trained had changed, not just in how they held a rifle, but in how they carried themselves. They became regulars at the range, but instead of standing around laughing at newcomers, they started helping them. Marcia didn't see it right away. She was still keeping her visits limited. But the range attendant told her the story over the phone one afternoon. "They're different now," he said. "It's like they're trying to live up to something." Then came the call from a local ROTC program. One of the instructors had read Daniel Cross's article and wanted to know if she'd speak to their cadets. At first, she was hesitant. Public speaking was never her style. She preferred letting her actions speak for her. But the instructor was persistent. "They don't need a speech, ma'am," he told her. "They just need to see someone who's walked the path and come out the other side." Marcia agreed, though she didn't admit it out loud, even to herself. That a small part of her was curious to see what it would be like. On the day of the talk, the cadets were lined up in a small lecture hall. Most of them were young, barely out of high school, eyes sharp with ambition, but still untested. She walked in wearing the same simple style she always did. No medals, no military dress, no fanfare. Just herself. When the instructor introduced her and mentioned her service record, the room straightened instantly. There was no laughter, no side comments, only silence and attention. She didn't give them a speech about glory or heroics. Instead, she talked about preparation, the hours spent practicing when no one was watching, the mental discipline it took to stay calm under pressure, and the humility to never underestimate another person. "You think being the best shot in the room matters," she told them. "It doesn't, not if you can't be trusted when it counts." Afterward, several cadets came up to her. Some just shook her hand, others asked for advice. But one young woman lingered longer than the rest. "My brother sent me the video," she said shyly. "The one from the range. I wasn't sure if I wanted to stick with this program, but seeing you outshoot everyone made me think maybe I can do it too." Marcia didn't smile often, but she did then. "Then don't quit," she said. "And when you're better than me, make sure you pass it on." 2 days later, Marcia returned to the range. The young men she had trained waved when she walked in. The range attendant handed her a laminated sheet, a printed photo of her perfect left eye shot, framed with the caption, "Never judge a shooter by their cover." It wasn't her style to hang things on walls, but she took it home anyway. She didn't see it as a trophy. It was a reminder of where she'd been, what she'd done, and the unexpected places her path still had left to go. What she didn't know then was that her story was far from over. Somewhere in another part of the country, a former commander had just read Daniel Cross's article, and that commander was about to make a call that would pull Marcia into a situation she thought she'd left behind forever. The phone call came on a Tuesday afternoon. Marcia had just finished cleaning her rifle after a few hours at the range. She was in her small kitchen, a kettle on the stove, when the landline rang. The same old phone that seemed to carry only important calls these days. She almost didn't answer, but something in her gut told her she should. "Marcia Thompson," she said. There was a pause. Then a voice she hadn't heard in over 15 years spoke. "Shadow Widow. It's Colonel Reeves." The name hit her like a jolt. Reeves wasn't just another officer. He had been her commanding officer during her last tour, the man who had signed off on her most dangerous missions. She'd thought she'd never hear from him again. "Colonel," she said cautiously, "it's been a long time." "Too long," he replied. "I wouldn't be calling unless it mattered." She leaned against the counter, her grip tightening on the receiver. "I'm retired, Colonel. Care you've got, I'm not the one for it. Normally, I'd agree," he said. "But this isn't normal. We've got a situation, and frankly, there's no one else I trust to handle it." Marcia stayed silent, letting him talk. He told her about a missing intelligence operative, a young recon specialist who'd been captured somewhere in Eastern Europe. Extraction teams had failed twice. The clock was running out, and the kicker. The specialist was the daughter of an old friend of Marcia's, someone she'd served with during her earliest days in the course. "We don't have much time," Reeves said. "And I need a shooter who can get in, get her out, and leave. Without a trace, you're still that shooter. Marcia stared out her kitchen window. The autumn light cast long shadows across the yard, and for a moment, she could almost feel the cold desert air of her old deployments, smell the faint tanks of gun oil, hear the steady heartbeat in her own ears before a critical shot. Why me? She asked quietly. Because they won't see you coming, Reeves said simply. They'll underestimate you. Just like they always have. And that's your greatest weapon. The next few seconds stretched into something heavy, she thought. About the years she'd spent away from the field. The quiet life she'd built, the firing range that had become her sanctuary. She thought about the cadets she'd spoken to, the people who had told her she inspired them. And she thought about the young woman out there, waiting for someone to come. You're asking me to break every promise I made to myself when I left. She finally said, I'm asking you to save a life. Reeves replied. By the time the kettle on the stove began to whistle, her mind was already made up. Send me the file, she said, and make sure you burn it after. There was a pause on the other end. Not surprise, but respect. I knew you'd say yes. We'll be in touch within 24 hours. The line went dead. Marcia set the receiver down slowly. She didn't move for a long time, her hand resting on the rifle case on the table. She wasn't smiling, but there was a certain sharpness in her eyes, a focus she hadn't felt in years. The quiet life would have to wait. The shadow widow was going back to work.